A frontier cabin stands silent at dawn. In the shadow of the Appalachians, a child's shoe lies where a door was kicked in. Across the Ohio, prisoners, women and children among them, are marched toward Detroit. For decades, settlers swore a single man paid for their scalps and unleashed terror on the backcountry under King George III. They gave him a name that stuck, Herr Buyer. But who was he? What did British policy really sanction? And which horrors are proven versus propaganda? This film dissects the record, orders, letters, raids, and graves to ask a brutal question. Did British imperial strategy enable the torture and killing of Appalachian children? And how much of that blame rests on one man? We trace the path from London's directives to Ohio country war parties, from Ruddle's Station to the Wyoming Valley, and into courtrooms and archives where reputations were made and destroyed. The myths are loud. The evidence is darker. Stay to the end. In the late 18th century, the Appalachian frontier stretched like a barrier of forest and mountains, dividing the seaboard colonies from the vast interior. To the east lay established towns, farms, and political centers tied to London or to revolutionary assemblies. To the west sprawled an uncertain world, a patchwork of native nations, contested hunting grounds, and thin lines of settler cabins that clung to river valleys. The Appalachians themselves were not a single ridge, but a series of rugged chains and plateaus, running from Pennsylvania through Virginia and into what would become Kentucky and Tennessee. To European settlers, the mountains marked both a promise of land and a threshold of danger. To native nations, they were a homeland under siege, the last barrier before dispossession. The frontier did not emerge suddenly in 1775. A decade earlier, the region had been torn apart by Pontiac's War. This conflict, sparked in 1763, saw native alliances resist British forts and settlements after the French ceded vast territories in North America. The violence demonstrated how fragile Britain's grasp over the Appalachian West truly was. British generals such as Geoffrey Amherst and Henry Bouquet wrestled with uprisings that struck forts at Detroit, Pitt, and other outposts, exposing the vulnerability of imperial rule beyond the mountains. That war left scars that never fully healed, deep mistrust between native groups and the crown, bitter memories among frontier settlers, and a clear demonstration that civilians, especially families, were as much targets as soldiers. In the aftermath, London's government imposed the Proclamation Line of 1763, forbidding colonial settlement beyond the crest of the Appalachians. On paper, this was meant to stabilize relations with native nations and avoid further costly wars. In practice, it was ignored. Squatters, land speculators, and restless families streamed westward into valleys of the Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee. This migration inflamed tensions with Shawnee, Delaware, Mingo, and other native peoples who saw their hunting grounds invaded. By the 1770s, the Appalachian frontier had become a zone of near-permanent skirmish, where imperial decrees carried little weight and survival depended on vigilance. When the American Revolution began, the frontier became a secondary but decisive theater. The war between crown and colonies was not limited to seaports or armies in formation. It spilled into the backcountry, where alliances with native nations became crucial. British commanders in Canada and Detroit sought to mobilize their indigenous allies to strike the rebelling colonists' vulnerable western flanks. With limited manpower and overstretched supply lines, Britain relied heavily on this partnership. Native war parties, often accompanied by loyalist rangers, struck across Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Kentucky. Their targets were not fortified cities but isolated homesteads, mills, and small stockaded stations. The settlers who lived behind the mountains were rarely soldiers by choice. They were families carving farms out of dense forest, living in cabins miles from any neighbor, often without protection beyond a crude palisade or rifle. This isolation made them easy prey for raiding parties. Children, the most defenseless members of these households, were especially vulnerable. Some were taken captive, forced to march north toward British posts such as Detroit, where they might be ransomed or adopted into native families. Others perished on the spot, victims of raids intended to terrorize and destabilize frontier expansion. The psychological impact was immense. Tales of massacres, Kidnappings and mutilation spread quickly, feeding both patriot propaganda and settler determination to retaliate. The Appalachian backcountry was not uniform in its loyalties. Some settlers remained loyal to the crown, particularly in the southern mountains where mistrust of coastal elites ran deep. Loyalist families often lived alongside patriots, creating communities riven by suspicion and revenge killings. Native nations, too, were divided. Some sought neutrality, while others allied with Britain in hopes of halting settler encroachment. The result was a theater of war without clear front lines, where every cabin was a potential battlefield and every journey through the forest a gamble with death. What distinguished the Appalachian conflict from the great campaigns of Washington or Cornwallis was the prominence of civilians as deliberate targets. Raids were designed not merely to kill, but to destabilize entire regions by driving survivors eastward in panic. The capture of children served practical purposes: leverage in prisoner exchanges, adoption to replace lost kin, and symbols of dominance. Yet to the families left behind, these acts were unspeakable horrors. The screams of a raided cabin or the sight of smoke from a neighbor's station could unravel entire communities, forcing militias into action and hardening racial and political hatred. British imperial aims after 1763 depended on balancing restraint with force. The Crown had neither the resources nor the desire to garrison every settlement west of the mountains. Instead, it pursued a strategy of supporting native allies who knew the terrain and could strike quickly. This reliance made British officials complicit in raids that inevitably swept up noncombatants. For Patriot leaders, this policy was evidence of tyranny and cruelty. For Britain, it was a calculated necessity in a war where resources were scarce. The cost, borne most often by children and women on the frontier, was justified in London as the price of maintaining empire. By the eve of the Revolution's western campaigns, the Appalachian frontier had become a crucible of violence. Memories of Pontiac's war lingered. British alliances ensured that every settler's cabin was exposed, and the divide between loyalist and patriot only deepened mistrust. For native nations, the war offered both opportunity and peril, but whichever side they chose, the result was devastation. In this setting, horror was not incidental but structural. The geography of the mountains, the isolation of settlements, and the imperial strategy of raids combined to ensure that families, especially children, would pay the heaviest price. The Appalachians of the 1770s were therefore not simply a line on a map. They were a killing ground born of competing visions of empire, rebellion, and survival. In this contested landscape, King George's reach extended through native allies and frontier officers, while patriot militias sought revenge through scorched earth campaigns. Between them lay the cabins of ordinary families, where the war was most brutal and where the suffering of children became both a tragic reality and a powerful weapon of propaganda. In 1763, when Britain's triumph over France seemed complete, the empire faced a revolt that revealed the fragility of its authority. Native nations across the Great Lakes and Ohio country rose in coordinated defiance against British forts and garrisons. Known as Pontiac's War, this conflict forced Britain's commanders to confront a reality they had not anticipated. The cost of victory in North America would not be measured only against France, but in the capacity to subdue and govern vast indigenous territories. At the center of Britain's military administration stood General Geoffrey Amherst, commander-in-chief of all forces in North America. Amherst had been praised for his role in seizing Canada, yet he regarded indigenous peoples with open contempt. His correspondence during the uprising is stark evidence of imperial arrogance. He did not speak of negotiating grievances or reconciling alliances. Instead, he framed the conflict in terms of eradication. In his eyes, indigenous resistance was not a political obstacle, but a racial enemy to be destroyed. This outlook hardened into a written order. In letters to Colonel Henry Bouquet, who commanded in Pennsylvania, Amherst suggested using disease as a weapon. He proposed that smallpox might be deliberately spread among native communities as a means of breaking resistance. Bouquet's reply did not reject the idea, he accepted its practicality in military terms. This was no fleeting comment, but a cold calculation. If Britain could not send enough troops to hold the frontier, Then contagion could serve as a substitute for manpower. The discussion between Amherst and Bouquet has become one of the most infamous documents of 18th century warfare. While historians debate the extent to which these ideas were acted upon, the exchange demonstrates how Britain's military elite conceived of frontier control. It revealed an empire willing to consider annihilation as a legitimate tactic. In an environment where conventional battles were rare and resources scarce, they believed terror and devastation could accomplish what armies could not. Bouquet himself embodied this pragmatic harshness. Tasked with relieving besieged posts in the Ohio Valley, he advocated campaigns that destroyed crops, burned villages, and drove communities into starvation. His strategy was less about decisive battle than about making life unsustainable for any group opposing British authority. For frontier families, these methods would later echo in American retaliation campaigns for native nations. They confirmed that Britain viewed them not as allies or negotiating partners, but as expendable obstacles. The significance of this exchange lies not only in the words, but in the precedent they set. Frontier war had always been cruel, yet Amherst's language stripped away any pretense of moderation. It legitimized the idea that extreme methods, including attacks on civilians, were acceptable tools of empire. Officers who came after him inherited this climate of thought. By the time of the American Revolution, commanders like Henry Hamilton did not need to invent cruelty. It had already been written into the empire's administrative culture. The memory of these orders persisted long after the guns of Pontiac's war fell silent. Among native communities, Amherst's contempt reinforced suspicions that Britain intended their extinction. Among colonial settlers, the very rumor of such policies deepened hatred of the crown. These attitudes hardened the lines of conflict when revolution came. Britain's reliance on native alliances during the revolution was viewed by rebels not as legitimate strategy, but as proof that the empire was willing to unleash savagery against its own subjects. Amherst was recalled in disgrace before the decade ended, but his legacy endured. His brief commands left behind a mindset in which humanitarian considerations were irrelevant, and the suffering of women and children was tolerated as collateral, if not deliberately encouraged. The empire had revealed its hand. When stretched too thin, it would abandon restraint and embrace ruthless expedients. Thus, the brutality that would later scar the Appalachian frontier during the Revolution was not an invention of the moment. It was the continuation of policies and attitudes formed in 1763, when the highest officers of Britain's military machine endorsed measures that blurred, and often erased, the boundary between combatant and civilian. This philosophy of repression created an environment where raids, starvation, and captivity became expected features of war. And it ensured that when King George's officers turned once again to the back country for control, they did so with a precedent of sanctioned cruelty already in place. By the late 1770s, Detroit had become the most important British stronghold in the Western theater of the American Revolution. Perched on the Detroit River, the fort was not a vast fortress in the European sense, but it was the empire's anchor in the Great Lakes region. From here, British officers coordinated supply lines, cultivated alliances with native nations, and directed raids deep into the American frontier. To settlers scattered across the Appalachian backcountry, the very name of Detroit conjured fear. It was from this remote outpost, they believed, that orders came to burn their cabins, seize their families, and strike terror into their communities. The man presiding over this frontier post was Lieutenant Governor Henry Hamilton. Born in Ireland and educated in England, Hamilton was a career soldier who had entered colonial administration through steady service. In 1775, he was appointed to oversee Detroit, a position that placed him at the heart of Britain's strategy to contain rebellion beyond the Appalachians. His role was less about direct command of troops and more about coordination, ensuring that native allies were armed, informed, and encouraged to harass the rebel settlements in Kentucky, Pennsylvania, and the Ohio Valley. Hamilton's command quickly became notorious. American patriots accused him of financing raids by paying bounties for scalps, including those of women and children. For this, he acquired a name that would haunt his legacy, the Hair Buyer. The label suggested not only cruelty, but a grotesque economy of human suffering, where children's lives were reduced to currency. The power of the nickname lay in its simplicity. It needed no detailed proof to terrify frontier families or to rally patriot propaganda. The historical record, however, is complex. Despite the widespread belief, there is no surviving document that explicitly orders Hamilton to pay for scalps. Official correspondence from his office refers to prisoner exchanges, logistical support, and military planning, but lacks the kind of direct instruction that propaganda accused him of. This absence has led modern historians to conclude that while Hamilton facilitated raids by native and loyalist forces, the charge of scalp purchasing remains unproven in archival evidence. Yet the absence of a signed order did little to soften perceptions on the ground. Raids launched from Detroit routinely produced captives and scalps. Families in Kentucky and the Ohio Valley reported the deaths of children, sometimes butchered on the spot, other times carried off, never to be seen again. When survivors returned, their testimony reinforced the idea that Hamilton's fort was a marketplace of terror. Patriots seized upon these accounts, publishing them in newspapers and embedding the hair buyer image deeply into the revolutionary imagination. Detroit itself was a grim destination for captives. Prisoners taken during raids were marched north, often hundreds of miles, through forests and rivers. Many perished before reaching the fort. Those who survived were confined in rough quarters, subject to disease, hunger, and uncertainty. Some were adopted into native families as replacements for lost kin, while others were held for ransom or exchanged. Although Hamilton was not personally present on raids, his position as governor tied him to the system that enabled them. His office distributed supplies and gifts to allied warriors, encouraged their campaigns, and benefited strategically from the fear they spread. The hair buyer accusation intensified after 1778, when Hamilton was captured by American forces during George Rogers Clark's audacious winter march to Vincennes. Taken prisoner, Hamilton faced the fury of patriot leaders who viewed him as the embodiment of frontier cruelty. Thomas Jefferson, then governor of Virginia, ordered Hamilton to be confined in irons. Jefferson justified this treatment by citing Hamilton's supposed record of paying for scalps and encouraging atrocities. Even though hard proof was lacking, the perception of his guilt was enough to justify extraordinary punishment. For Hamilton, this period of captivity was deeply humiliating. He protested his treatment, insisting that he had acted as any officer of the crown would in frontier war. But the patriot public was unmoved. Newspapers and pamphlets circulated stories of his alleged crimes, cementing the hair buyer epithet in popular memory. In the revolutionary narrative, he was not just another British officer. He was the very face of imperial barbarity. After his eventual release and exchange, Hamilton's career never fully recovered. Though he later held posts in Canada and the West Indies, his reputation remained overshadowed by the accusations of the 1770s. To the Americans, he was a villain. To Britain, he was a capable administrator whose name had been permanently blackened by colonial propaganda. In truth, Hamilton's role illustrates the ambiguity of frontier warfare, an official who did not personally scalp or torture, yet who enabled a system in which families, and especially children, were routinely destroyed. What makes Hamilton's case chilling is not only what he may or may not have ordered, but the broader reality he represented. Whether or not he paid for scalps, raids under his oversight resulted in the deaths of children and the terror of entire communities. The hair buyer story captured an underlying truth. The British Empire, from Detroit, had sanctioned a form of war that blurred all boundaries between soldier and settler, between combatant and child. Hamilton became the perfect symbol because his position at Detroit tied him directly to the machinery of that violence. In the end, the man and the myth merged. To patriot families who buried children slain in raids, it hardly mattered whether Hamilton's hand had signed a bounty slip. To them, Detroit was the source of their nightmares, and Hamilton its architect. His legacy demonstrates how propaganda, fueled by genuine suffering, can outlast evidence. More importantly, it shows how empire's distant orders, delivered through men like Hamilton, manifested on the frontier as terror visited upon the youngest and most vulnerable. The violence that erupted along the Appalachian frontier during the Revolution did not resemble the pitched battles fought on the eastern seaboard. It was a war of raids, small, mobile forces striking suddenly, vanishing into forests, and leaving behind burning cabins and scattered survivors. For the families who had ventured west of the mountains, this form of warfare was relentless. Every creek crossing or night's sleep carried the possibility of attack, and every isolated household lived under the constant shadow of dread. Raids were not random outbursts of cruelty, they were calculated instruments of war. British officials at Detroit and Quebec encouraged their native allies and loyalist auxiliaries to strike at the vulnerable line of settlements pushing into Kentucky, Pennsylvania, and the Ohio Valley. These expeditions had multiple purposes. They disrupted Patriot expansion, forced militia to remain tied to local defense, and spread fear among communities already stretched thin. Success was measured less in territorial gain than in the panic and paralysis inflicted on the settlers. The typical raiding party was small, often no more than several dozen men, moving quickly and lightly through forest paths. Their strength lay not in numbers but in speed, surprise, and intimate knowledge of the land. They could strike a lonely cabin, seize its inhabitants, burn its stores of food, and be gone before reinforcements arrived. Even fortified stations, small blockhouses surrounded by cabins, were not immune. Some withstood attack, but others fell in hours, their residents killed or dragged away as prisoners. Children were central victims of this system. On a practical level, they slowed the flight of families and made them easy targets. They were also symbols of future settlement. By striking children, raiders struck at the very continuity of frontier society. Many were killed outright in assaults, but others were taken captive, marched northward toward Detroit or into native villages. Captivity served multiple functions. Children could be exchanged for prisoners held by the Patriots, ransomed for goods, or incorporated into native families. Adoption was not uncommon. Some children grew into adulthood within their captors' communities, never returning to their birth families. For the settlers left behind, the uncertainty was its own torment. A child carried away might still live, or might die of exposure or exhaustion along the trail. Parents could only imagine the fate of their sons and daughters, fueling rumors that magnified the terror. Reports circulated of infants killed because they could not keep pace, or of young captives forced to witness the deaths of their kin. Whether every tale was true mattered little. They confirmed what communities already believed, that the frontier was a landscape where childhood itself was a target of war. The raids also aimed at supplies. Destroying crops, killing livestock, and seizing food ensured that surviving families faced hunger even if they escaped direct violence. Winter months were especially cruel. A raid in October or November could doom an entire community to starvation, since cornfields and granaries were essential for survival. Thus, even when children were not directly attacked, they bore the brunt of the deprivation that followed. Malnutrition, illness, and displacement often claimed more young lives than the tomahawk or musket. Marches to Detroit, when prisoners were taken, were ordeals in themselves. Children had to cover vast distances on foot, often without proper clothing or food. Those too young to keep pace were sometimes abandoned or killed. Survivors recalled endless days of walking, nights of exposure, and the constant fear of execution. The march was not merely a transfer of captives, it was another form of attrition, a test that only the strongest or luckiest survived. At Detroit, the fates of children varied. Some were handed over to British authorities, entered into official prisoner registers, and later exchanged. Others remained in native custody, beyond the reach of negotiation. For families desperate to recover them, the fort became both a symbol of hope and despair, a place where children might be found alive, but also a place where they could vanish forever. The British role was deeply compromised by supporting raids and welcoming prisoners into their orbit. Officials like Hamilton could claim administrative detachment while reaping the strategic benefits of a system that tore children from their homes. The psychological impact of this style of warfare cannot be overstated. Families lived not in confidence but in constant alarm. Communities built blockhouses, posted nightly guards, and kept weapons within arm's reach. Still, the fear of sudden attack eroded morale and trust. Some settlers abandoned their claims altogether, retreating eastward. Others hardened into militias bent on vengeance, striking native villages in brutal retaliation. This cycle of raid and reprisal ensured that the suffering of children was never one-sided. Atrocities on both sides became fuel for endless violence. In the broader war, these raids rarely decided grand campaigns. Washington's armies and British regiments fought their battles in the East, but in the West, families measured the revolution not in declarations or treaties, but in graves and missing children. The war behind the mountains was intimate, chaotic, and devastatingly personal. It was a conflict in which the innocence of childhood offered no protection, and in which survival depended on chance as much as courage. The mechanics of these raids, small, swift, and merciless, explain why the image of the hair buyer became so potent. Settlers saw their children vanish or die, and Detroit was the ultimate destination. Whether Hamilton directly ordered such acts was irrelevant to grieving parents. What mattered was the pattern raids were launched, children suffered, and British officers stood behind the system that made it possible. In the summer of 1780, the British sought to press their advantage in the Western theater by launching a major expedition into Kentucky. At its head was Captain Henry Byrd, a regular officer stationed at Detroit. Unlike the small raids that typically harassed isolated cabins, this campaign was organized, equipped with artillery, and aimed at breaking the fragile chain of frontier settlements once and for all. It would become one of the most devastating blows suffered by Kentucky settlers during the Revolution, remembered above all for the suffering it inflicted on families and children. Byrd assembled a mixed force of British soldiers, Loyalist auxiliaries, and a large contingent of native allies, principally Shawnee and Delaware. His column carried 2 small cannons, an unusual addition to frontier warfare, and a weapon settlers were ill prepared to face. Moving south from the Great Lakes into Kentucky, the force struck with speed and confidence, targeting 2 of the region's most vulnerable strongholds, Ruddle's Station and Martin's Station. Ruddle's Station, a small fortified settlement on the South Fork of the Licking River, was the first to fall. The families sheltering inside the palisade had endured years of raids, but they had never faced artillery. When Byrd's cannons opened fire, the defenders realized their walls would not hold. To spare their families from massacre, they agreed to surrender, but what followed was not the orderly handover the settlers expected. As the gates opened, native warriors rushed in ahead of British officers, seizing plunder, scalping some defenders, and dragging captives into custody. Chaos reigned. Families were torn apart in the melee. Some prisoners were struck down in front of their children. Reports from survivors later described infants killed in the confusion, a detail that entered frontier memory as one of the most horrifying acts of the war. The fall of Ruddle's Station produced more than 100 captives, many of them women and children. They were quickly marched north, even as Byrd's column moved against Martin's Station, located nearby. The pattern repeated. Outnumbered and facing artillery, the defenders surrendered. Once again, the release of captives to the mercy of war parties led to scenes of violence. By the end of the expedition, nearly 400 prisoners had been seized across both stations, an unprecedented number for a single frontier campaign. The journey to Detroit was a nightmare. Families were forced to march hundreds of miles on foot, carrying what little they could salvage. Food was scarce, clothing inadequate, and discipline among the raiding parties inconsistent. Children stumbled under the strain, some collapsing from exhaustion. Accounts tell of young captives, killed when they could not keep pace, while others were given over to different native families along the route, never to be reunited with their parents. Disease and hunger took additional lives. For survivors, the trek was seared into memory as a march of misery where no child was safe. At Detroit, the prisoners were divided according to the interests of their captors. Some were delivered to British authorities and entered into registers for eventual exchange. Others were retained by native families, adopted as replacements for relatives lost in war. For children, this often meant permanent separation. Some grew up within native villages, learning new languages and customs, while their families back in Kentucky mourned them as dead. A few were eventually ransomed or returned after the war, but many never came home. The impact of Byrd's invasion was immediate and far-reaching. On the Kentucky frontier, the loss of so many settlers in a single campaign shook morale to the core. Families who had believed in the promise of new land now faced the specter of annihilation. Communities debated abandoning the region altogether. Although Kentucky ultimately survived, the psychological damage was lasting. Ruddle's and Martin's stations became symbols of vulnerability, remembered not for military defeat alone but for the destruction of families. For American leaders, the invasion served as further proof of Britain's cruelty. The presence of regular officers alongside native allies made it clear that these atrocities were not the work of rogue parties alone, but of a system sanctioned by the Crown. The stories of children killed or carried into captivity spread quickly, reinforcing the narrative that British commanders encouraged violence against the innocent. Byrd himself avoided the reputation of hair buyer, but his expedition became one of the clearest examples of how British frontier policy translated into mass suffering for settlers. In retrospect, Byrd's invasion illustrates the scale of devastation possible when frontier warfare shifted from small raids to organized campaigns. The use of artillery, the sheer number of captives, and the brutal treatment of prisoners exposed the fragility of the Kentucky settlements. It also underscored how, in this theater, children were not incidental victims, but deliberate pawns in a wider strategy of terror and displacement. The fall of Ruddle's and Martin's stations revealed the human cost of Britain's reliance on raids of broken families, scattered communities, and a generation of children marked by captivity, loss, or death. In the summer of 1778, a different frontier tragedy unfolded far from Kentucky, in the fertile Wyoming Valley of northeastern Pennsylvania. This region, along the Susquehanna River, had been contested for decades. It was settled largely by Connecticut families under the Susquehanna Company, yet claimed by Pennsylvania authorities. By the outbreak of the Revolution, the valley was both strategically important and bitterly divided, with families of varying loyalties and a frontier exposed to native and loyalist attack. For British commanders in Canada and New York, the valley presented an opportunity. By striking deep into Pennsylvania, they could punish rebel communities, disrupt supply lines, and remind settlers that the Crown's reach extended even into remote agricultural regions. To carry out such operations, the British turned once again to their most effective frontier instrument, Loyalist Rangers allied with native war parties. In July 1778, a combined force under John Butler, a Loyalist officer, entered the valley with roughly 1,000 men, partly Butler's Rangers, but primarily Seneca and other Iroquois warriors. The settlers, hastily organized into militia, mustered perhaps 300 defenders, many of them elderly men or young boys. Their vulnerability was compounded by the absence of Continental troops, who had been withdrawn to support operations elsewhere. On July 3rd, the two sides met near Forty Fort, the settlers' principal stronghold. The militia advanced rashly into open ground, where they were quickly outflanked. The engagement disintegrated into rout. Many defenders were cut down as they fled toward the fort, others captured. What followed seared itself into frontier memory. A number of prisoners were executed, some by ritual methods intended as vengeance for past attacks on Iroquois villages. The reports that circulated described scalping, torture, and mutilation. Though not all accounts can be verified, the perception was clear. The battle had become a massacre. The effect on civilians was immediate. With the militia destroyed, the valley lay defenseless. Families abandoned farms and fled eastward, carrying only what they could. Panic spread along the Susquehanna as word of the slaughter grew. Some settlers drowned in the river while attempting to escape. Others perished from exhaustion or hunger in the forests. For children, the ordeal was catastrophic. Accounts tell of families separated in the flight, infants lost or killed, and young captives carried away by raiding parties. The destruction of Wyoming Valley shocked the Patriot cause. Newspapers labeled the event the Wyoming Massacre, presenting it as proof of British barbarity and native savagery under Crown sanction. The emphasis fell on the killing of noncombatants, especially women and children. Though historians debate the scale of these atrocities, what is beyond dispute is that hundreds of settlers were displaced, dozens were killed, and entire communities were left in ruin. The psychological consequences reached far beyond Pennsylvania. Patriot leaders seized on the incident to rally support for retaliation. The following year, General John Sullivan led a massive expedition into Iroquois country, burning villages, destroying crops, and driving thousands of indigenous men, women, and children into starvation and displacement. The Wyoming events thus not only traumatized one valley, but also unleashed a broader cycle of reprisal that devastated the Iroquois Confederacy. From the perspective of frontier families, the lesson of Wyoming was unmistakable. Children were not protected by innocence, nor spared by circumstance. The war blurred every line between soldier and civilian. Settlements themselves became military targets, and with their destruction came the predictable suffering of the youngest inhabitants. Survivors' testimonies, whether of massacre, captivity, or flight, became part of the revolutionary narrative of victimhood, shaping how generations remembered the British and their allies. The Wyoming Valley tragedy also illustrates the propaganda power of frontier horror. Patriot writers did not need to invent atrocities. Real suffering provided enough material, but they exaggerated details to inflame public outrage, ensuring that Wyoming became synonymous with slaughter. Even George Washington referred to it in correspondence as evidence of the enemy's savage methods. For the families who buried their dead or never saw their children again, the propaganda was not exaggeration. It was lived reality. In sum, the events of July 1778 exemplify the character of the Revolutionary Frontier War. They were swift, devastating, and aimed at breaking the will of settler communities. They showed how quickly an entire valley could be emptied, how easily families could be scattered, and how children became casualties not only of musket fire but of hunger, terror, and forced displacement. Wyoming was not the largest battle of the Revolution, nor the most strategically decisive, but it was among the most haunting, precisely because it struck at civilians in their homes and fields. The Wyoming Valley Massacre, like Byrd's invasion in Kentucky, underscores that the Revolution's Western War was defined not by formal armies, but by raids against families. The devastation of July 1778 entered the annals of memory as proof that the frontier was a war against children as much as against soldiers. In this way, the valley became both a battlefield and a graveyard of innocence. For many frontier families, the nightmare did not end when a raid was over. If they survived the initial assault, they faced the long, grueling march north toward Detroit. This outpost, the British Empire's command center in the Western Theater, became a destination for thousands of captives during the Revolution. For those taken alive, men, women, and especially children, Detroit was not a place of liberation, but the heart of a system that treated people as bargaining chips in a grim commerce of war. The journey itself left captives broken. Marches from Kentucky, Pennsylvania, and Ohio covered hundreds of miles through wilderness. Prisoners were given little food, often surviving on scraps or what they could forage. Ill-clad children walked barefoot across sharp ground or through rivers, exposed to cold and disease. The weak and sick often collapsed, and their fate was merciless. Accounts describe those unable to continue being killed, while others were abandoned to starvation. For a child, the ordeal of the march was frequently a death sentence before Detroit was ever reached. Those who survived entered a strange and uncertain limbo. Detroit was a functioning town with traders, soldiers, and administrators, yet for captives it was a prison. Families were separated upon arrival. Some children were handed to British officers, recorded in registers, and held in cramped quarters awaiting possible exchange. Others were retained by native allies and adopted into villages along the Great Lakes, a practice with deep cultural roots. For indigenous families who had lost relatives to disease or war, adoption provided renewal. For settler parents, it meant permanent loss. The British authorities presiding over Detroit had little interest in the humanity of the captives. They viewed prisoners as assets to be used in negotiations or exchanged for loyalists held by the Americans. In some cases, children were traded like commodities, valued not for who they were, but for their usefulness in bargaining. This system reduced human life to currency. It also meant that children could be trapped in captivity for years, pawns in a slow, moving game of war and diplomacy. Conditions for those confined within Detroit were bleak. Food supplies were limited, and captives frequently endured hunger. Disease spread quickly in the crowded quarters. Many prisoners, especially children, weakened by the march and poor nutrition, succumbed to illness. For those who survived, each day was marked by uncertainty they might be exchanged, ransomed, or remain indefinitely in British custody. For mothers, the agony was compounded by not knowing whether children taken by native allies would ever be seen again. The psychological scars of Detroit were as lasting as the physical. Survivors who were later freed recalled the fear of being treated as property, the despair of hearing other captives cry for missing children, and the humiliation of being paraded as proof of victory. For children old enough to understand, the memory of being confined, separated from parents, and left in strangers' hands became a trauma carried for life. For those too young to remember, the scars were borne by families who never stopped mourning their absence. British officers such as Henry Hamilton claimed that they did not sanction cruelty, but their complicity in the system was undeniable. By encouraging raids, accepting prisoners, and presiding over exchanges, they sustained the machinery that uprooted families and condemned children to suffering. The official record may lack orders for scalp bounties, but the registers of captives at Detroit testify to an organized commerce in human lives. Each name inscribed in those lists represents a story of terror on the frontier and misery in captivity. The fate of captives varied. Some children were eventually exchanged, reunited with families after months or years. Yet reintegration was not always simple. Those adopted into native communities sometimes resisted return, having formed new bonds and identities. Others came back broken in body or spirit, scarred by deprivation and violence. For many families, the losses were permanent. A son or daughter disappeared into the record at Detroit and never returned. Detroit's role in the Revolutionary Frontier War thus exposes the darker logic of empire. The Crown could claim legality, pointing to prisoner exchanges as standard wartime practice, but the reality was that this system was built on raids that deliberately targeted families, forcing children into the economy of war. The suffering was predictable and tolerated as a cost of strategy. For the empire, these captives were pawns. For the settlers, they were their children. In the broader memory of the war, Detroit became synonymous with fear. To frontier settlers, it was not a trading hub but the place where loved ones vanished. The stories of children taken north became part of a collective narrative that depicted the British as sanctioning atrocities. Even after the war ended, the scars lingered. Survivors spoke of Detroit as the darkest chapter of their captivity, while those who never returned lived on only as names etched in grief. The prison registers, the ransom accounts, and the testimonies of survivors all point to the same conclusion: Detroit was not simply a fort. It was the administrative heart of a system that transformed human beings, many of them children, into instruments of policy, and in that system, innocence was irrelevant. Childhood did not shield the young from capture, hunger, or death. Detroit stood as a reminder that, under King George's rule, frontier war reduced even the smallest victims to commodities of empire. In any war, battles are fought not only with weapons but with words. On the American frontier during the Revolution, atrocity stories became a crucial weapon in the struggle for morale, recruitment, and international sympathy. No figure better illustrates this dynamic than Henry Hamilton, the lieutenant governor at Detroit. To American settlers, Hamilton was the face of British cruelty. To patriot leaders, he was a gift, a living symbol of tyranny that could be used to unify and inflame the cause. The nickname, Hair Buyer, captured the imagination of the colonies. It suggested that Hamilton not only tolerated but actively paid for the scalps of American men, women, and children. The image was simple, brutal, and effective. a bureaucratic administrator in Detroit was transformed into a villain who profited from human suffering. There was no need for complex argument. The very phrase implied a market in death. Once the name circulated, it stuck, regardless of whether documentary evidence existed to prove the charge. Patriot newspapers seized upon every report of raids to reinforce the story. When settlements in Kentucky or Pennsylvania were attacked and families killed or taken, Hamilton's name was invoked as the mastermind. Survivor testimonies, grief-stricken, vivid, and desperate, were reprinted, often without verification. Exaggerated details spread quickly. Infants dashed against walls, children burned alive, captives tortured in public. Some of these stories were based on truth, others embellished, and still others purely rumor. In the climate of fear, few paused to question. Leaders recognized the power of these tales. Thomas Jefferson, serving as governor of Virginia, personally ensured that Hamilton's capture in 1779 became a spectacle. When George Rogers Clark seized Vincennes and forced Hamilton's surrender, Jefferson ordered him placed in irons. The justification was clear. Hamilton had, in Jefferson's words, waged a war of indiscriminate murder. Whether or not Hamilton had personally ordered such acts was irrelevant. In patriot rhetoric, he was guilty by association, the man who had enabled the system of terror radiating from Detroit. Propaganda functioned on several levels. For settlers on the frontier, it validated their suffering, offering a face to blame for the chaos around them. For Eastern audiences, it dramatized the stakes of the war, presenting British rule as a force that sanctioned atrocities against children. For international observers, especially in France, it reinforced the idea that Britain's empire was corrupt and inhumane, strengthening sympathy for the patriot cause. Hamilton, therefore, was more than a man. He was a political instrument. The effectiveness of this campaign lay in its simplicity. Complex realities of frontier warfare, native grievances, loyalist motives, the chaos of raids, were compressed into one narrative. Hamilton paid for scalps. The image of the hair buyer was clear, portable, and endlessly repeatable. It did not require nuance, and it demanded no distinction between rumor and fact. In war, such clarity is a powerful weapon. Hamilton protested vigorously. During his captivity, he wrote letters defending his conduct, pointing out that he had acted no differently from other officers in encouraging native allies to harass enemy settlements. He denied paying for scalps and insisted he had sought to protect prisoners. But his words carried little weight against the tide of propaganda. In Patriot America, his guilt had already been sealed by public opinion. The endurance of the hair buyer myth speaks to the deep human need to personalize evil. Frontier warfare was messy, decentralized, and brutal on all sides. Yet it was easier to believe that one man embodied its cruelty than to confront the broader reality of a system that sanctioned raids, captivity, and civilian suffering. By demonizing Hamilton, Americans simplified the chaos of frontier war into a moral lesson. The empire itself was barbaric, and rebellion was the only defense against it. This propaganda had lasting consequences. Long after the revolution ended, the name, hair buyer, lingered in histories and local lore. Hamilton's reputation never recovered, even though modern historians find no direct evidence of scalp bounties. The power of the myth overshadowed the reality. The suffering of children on the frontier was real, but it was folded into a narrative that gave the Patriots both moral superiority and a tool for rallying support. In examining this propaganda, one must recognize both its distortion and its foundation. Raids did devastate families. Children were killed, starved, or carried into captivity. Hamilton's office at Detroit facilitated the system that made such suffering possible. The leap from complicity to direct scalp buyer was propaganda's work, but it was effective because it reflected genuine trauma. For settlers burying children or searching for lost kin, Hamilton did not need to sign bounty slips. His name already symbolized the terror they endured. Thus, the making of a villain was not an accident of rumor. It was a deliberate construction, crafted by patriot leaders, printed in newspapers, and sustained by grief-stricken communities. Hamilton became less a man than an embodiment of imperial cruelty, and through him, the revolutionary narrative secured one of its most enduring images, that King George's officers, through scalp, buying, and terror, had waged war on children themselves. Frontier war was never a simple clash of good and evil. Both sides inflicted horrors, and civilians, especially children, paid the heaviest price. If British, Allied raids filled Patriot newspapers with accounts of murdered or kidnapped settlers, there were also moments when American forces carried out atrocities just as shocking. Among the most infamous was the Naden-Titan massacre of 1782, when Pennsylvania militiamen butchered nearly 100 Christian Indians, many of them women and children. It remains one of the darkest stains on the Revolutionary era. The victims were Lenape, also known as Delaware, who had converted to Christianity under the influence of Moravian missionaries. These communities, settled in villages such as Naden-Titan in the Ohio country, had long tried to remain neutral. They sought to distance themselves from the larger conflict between crown and colonies, holding to their religious convictions of peace. Yet in the chaos of frontier war, neutrality offered little protection. Both British, Allied natives, and Patriot militias suspected them of aiding the enemy. In early 1782, a militia force from Pennsylvania, led by Colonel David Williamson, marched into the Ohio frontier. Their motivation was revenge. Months of raids had left western Pennsylvania scarred, and settlers clamored for retribution. When they encountered the Christian Lenape at Naden-Titan, they assumed guilt by association. It did not matter that these people had not taken part in raids. To the militia, they were Indians, and therefore enemies. The Lenape offered no resistance. Believing themselves safe in their neutrality, they welcomed the militia, even providing food. But Williamson's men quickly turned on them. The community was seized, accused of complicity in frontier attacks, and condemned without trial. In cold deliberation, the militia voted on the fate of their captives. The verdict was unanimous execution. The method of killing was systematic. Men, women, and children were bound and divided into separate houses. Prayers were offered as the doomed sang hymns, a final testimony to their faith. Then, one by one, they were led out and slaughtered with mallets and tomahawks. The massacre lasted hours. When it was over, around 90 people lay dead, nearly 2/3 of them women and children. The killers piled the bodies in the mission buildings and set them ablaze. The atrocity shocked even some of the militia themselves. A few men protested but were overruled. Others carried out the executions with grim efficiency, convinced that vengeance justified every act. In the eyes of frontier settlers, it was repayment for years of suffering at native hands. But in reality, it was the indiscriminate murder of a pacifist community, one that had deliberately chosen peace. News of Naden-Titan spread quickly. Patriot leaders in the East expressed embarrassment, aware of how such an act undermined their claims to moral superiority. British officials seized on the massacre as propaganda, pointing to it as proof that the rebels were no more humane than the empire they condemned. For native nations, the massacre was another bitter lesson. Neutrality and Christianity offered no protection from the violence of white settlers. Many who had wavered in their alliances now threw themselves more firmly into Britain's camp, convinced that the American cause meant extermination. The moral weight of Naden-Titan lies in its context. Just as settlers had accused Hamilton of buying scalps, now native communities pointed to the massacre as evidence of American barbarity. The war's brutality was not confined to one side. Children had been victims in Kentucky, Pennsylvania, and the Ohio Valley at the hands of British, Allied raiders. At Naden-Titan, children became victims of Patriot vengeance. Their deaths stripped away any illusion that one cause fought cleanly while the other committed atrocities. The massacre also illustrates the dangerous logic of total war on the frontier. Once raids blurred the line between combatant and non-combatant, retaliation inevitably extended to entire communities. The militia who killed at Naden-Titan believed they were avenging their own children lost in raids. In reality, they slaughtered innocents who bore no responsibility for those crimes. The cycle of vengeance consumed all sides, ensuring that children, native and settler alike, were repeatedly targeted as symbols of the enemy's future. Memory of the massacre endured for generations. Among the Lenape, it became a defining wound, remembered as proof of betrayal and cruelty. Among American settlers, It was quietly acknowledged but often justified as a product of war. Only later did it emerge more fully as a national shame, a reminder that the revolution's rhetoric of liberty was compromised by acts of savagery on the frontier. By placing Naden beside Ruddle's Station in Wyoming, the true character of the Western War becomes clear. It was not a conflict where one side held a monopoly on cruelty. Both Crown and rebels sanctioned or tolerated actions that devastated families. Both produced narratives that demonized the other while ignoring their own crimes. And in both cases, children bore the cost, killed in raids, lost in captivity, or murdered in massacres. Naden forces us to confront the moral tangle of the revolutionary frontier. The war was not simply Britain unleashing terror, nor patriots defending liberty. It was a struggle where vengeance overrode restraint, where neutrality brought no safety, and where innocence offered no shield. The massacre stands as grim evidence that atrocity was woven into the fabric of the conflict itself, not as an aberration but as a recurring pattern of frontier war. The charge that Britain waged war on children through scalp bounties and sanctioned atrocities has echoed for nearly 2.5 centuries. To settlers in the 1770s and 1780s, the image was undeniable: families shattered, children killed in raids, captives marched into the forests toward Detroit. To patriot leaders, the evidence seemed overwhelming, yet when examined through the lens of surviving documents, the picture is less clear. The question remains: did British policy directly enable crimes against children, or was this perception the product of propaganda layered upon the brutal realities of frontier war? The most notorious accusation centers on Henry Hamilton, governor of Detroit, remembered as the hair buyer. According to Patriot accounts, Hamilton paid warriors for scalps, including those of women and children, yet no direct documentary proof survives. His correspondence with superiors contains no instruction to issue scalp bounties. British records, meticulous in many other respects, reveal nothing resembling a ledger of such payments. Instead, they describe gifts of arms, powder, and supplies to native allies, a long-standing imperial practice designed to maintain alliances and encourage raids, but not a written bounty system for scalps. This absence has led historians to caution against accepting patriot claims at face value. The label hair buyer functioned as propaganda, a powerful simplification of a complex reality. Hamilton's role was administrative. He supported Allied warriors and benefited strategically from their raids, but the charge that he literally purchased scalps remains unsubstantiated. Yet absence of paperwork does not equate to innocence. British officers did not need to order scalp purchases for child deaths to occur. By relying heavily on native war parties to harass frontier settlements, they set in motion a system that almost inevitably targeted civilians. Raids could not distinguish between militia and family, between adult and child. The destruction of cabins, fields, and stations guaranteed that non-combatants would suffer. The British sanctioned the strategy, provided material support, and accepted captives into Detroit. In this sense, they enabled the conditions under which children were killed, starved, or carried into captivity. Consider Byrd's invasion of Kentucky in 1780. Hundreds of captives, many of them children, were seized when Ruddle's and Martin's stations fell. The British regulars present could not, or would not, control their allies once the gates were opened. Families were separated, infants killed, and children marched northward. The campaign had been authorized by British command, the artillery supplied by the Crown, and the prisoners delivered to Detroit. Whether or not Hamilton or Byrd paid for scalps, the Empire bore responsibility for sanctioning the raid itself, which predictably produced child victims. The Wyoming Valley Massacre of 1778 offers another example. British Loyalist forces under John Butler and their Iroquois allies devastated the settlement, killing militiamen and civilians alike. Children died in the aftermath, either in flight or in executions of captives. Was this ordered by London? No. Was it enabled by Britain's strategy of unleashing Loyalist and native auxiliaries without restraint? Yes. Britain's reliance on irregular forces allowed a cycle of violence in which atrocities became inevitable. Patriot propaganda exaggerated these horrors, often with gruesome detail. Yet exaggeration does not erase the truth beneath. Children were indeed killed in raids. captives were indeed marched north in misery, Detroit did indeed function as a depot for human prisoners. The scalping, bounty myth simplified this into a single image, but the structural reality was just as damning. British policy tolerated, and in fact depended upon, a form of warfare in which children could not escape harm. The Nadentean Massacre of 1782, carried out by American militiamen, proves the point further. The slaughter of nearly 100 peaceful Lenape, most of them women and children, was not British policy at all. It was American vengeance. This atrocity reveals that atrocities were not exclusive to one side, but were embedded in the nature of frontier war itself. If patriots could kill children in the name of retaliation, then Britain's reliance on terrorizing raids was part of the same grim logic. Neither side wrote official orders to massacre children, but both created conditions where such massacres occurred. What the documents ultimately reveal is a spectrum. At one end are explicit policies, Amherst's 1763 letters contemplating biological warfare, for instance, that show Britain's willingness to consider extreme measures. At the other end are the myths, like Hamilton's scalp purchasing, which lack hard proof but resonated because they aligned with settler experience of loss. Between these poles lies the reality, a sanctioned strategy of irregular war, where Britain armed and encouraged its allies to raid, accepted the captives, and benefited from the fear these attacks inspired. The verdict, then, is sobering. No surviving paper proves that King George's officers ordered scalp bounties for children, but British policy, by design, unleashed war parties on the frontier that burned cabins, killed families, and carried off the young. The suffering of Appalachian children was not incidental. It was predictable. The Empire accepted that price for the sake of tying down patriot forces and protecting its own strongholds. Whether or not Hamilton bought hair, Britain bought terror, and the currency was paid by the lives of children. By 1782, the revolutionary frontier had been soaked in blood for years. The raids, marches, massacres, and retaliations had left hundreds of children dead or scattered into captivity. Yet wars eventually end, and with them comes the question of accountability. What became of Henry Hamilton, branded the hair buyer? What became of the captives taken to Detroit? And how did communities remember their losses once the shooting stopped? Hamilton's personal fate was bound up with George Rogers Clark's campaign. In February 1779, Clark's small but determined force surprised Hamilton at Vincennes, deep in the Wabash country. The surrender was humiliating. Hamilton had been confident that his native allies and British regulars gave him superiority on the frontier, but Clark's winter march shattered that illusion. When Hamilton was delivered into American hands, the Patriots saw more than a captured officer. They saw an opportunity. Thomas Jefferson, governor of Virginia, insisted Hamilton be treated not as a prisoner of war but as a criminal. He was chained, placed in irons, and confined in conditions that shocked even some American observers. The justification was clear: Hamilton was accused of paying for scalps, encouraging massacres, and unleashing war on settlers' children. Whether evidence existed mattered little. His reputation as the hair buyer had already sealed his guilt in the eyes of his captors. For nearly 2 years, he remained confined under harsh conditions before finally being exchanged. Hamilton's career continued, but the stain never lifted. In later postings, he performed capably as an administrator, yet his name remained synonymous with atrocity. In Britain, he was regarded as a loyal servant maligned by propaganda. In America, he was remembered as a monster. His treatment demonstrated how powerful the narrative of frontier suffering had become. It overrode the conventions of warfare and turned an officer into a symbol of empire's cruelty. While Hamilton endured captivity, thousands of others, settler families and especially children, remained prisoners in a different sense. At Detroit, registers listed captives to be exchanged, but many never returned. Exchanges occurred sporadically, negotiated between military commanders or mediated by traders. Some children were released years after their capture, walking back into lives they no longer recognized. Others had been adopted into native communities and refused to leave, having grown attached to new families. For parents who had waited in anguish, Such choices were devastating reminders of how captivity transformed identity as much as it claimed lives. The end of the war in 1783 did not immediately resolve these questions. Treaties between Britain and the United States did not compel the return of every captive. Some native nations resisted giving up adopted children, regarding them as members of their households. The loss was permanent for many settler families who never discovered whether their children lived or died. For Native communities, the bonds formed through adoption reflected both cultural practice and the irreplaceable losses they had endured. The suffering of one side mirrored the suffering of the other. Memory became the battleground after the fighting ended. In Kentucky and Pennsylvania, oral traditions and local histories preserved stories of children carried into captivity, of infants killed in raids, of mothers begging for mercy. These accounts were retold at commemorations, sermons, and family gatherings. They reinforced a shared identity built around loss and endurance. The fallen stations and massacred valleys became sacred ground, remembered less for strategic importance than for the innocence of the victims. In Native communities, memory took a different form. The wars were recalled as a struggle for survival against relentless expansion. The adoptions of children into Native families were not viewed as atrocities, but as acts of healing, ways to replace those lost to smallpox, war, or famine. Yet even here, the memory of betrayal, especially massacres like Naden-Teton, remained vivid. For both Native and settler communities, children stood at the center of remembrance, as symbols of suffering, innocence, and injustice. The revolutionary settlement left scars rather than closure. On the frontier, burned cabins were rebuilt, fields replanted. But the absence of children who never returned haunted households. For families, grief turned into anger, and anger into a hardened resolve against Britain and Native nations alike. For Native peoples, the memory of massacres fueled mistrust of the new American Republic. The cycle of violence did not end in 1783. It simply shifted into new forms during the decades of expansion that followed. Hamilton's survival and eventual return to British service contrasted sharply with the fate of the countless children whose names were lost to history. He lived out his life with a tarnished reputation, but a life nonetheless. The children whose bodies lay along frontier trails or whose identities dissolved into adoption had no such second chance. Their memory was preserved only in the grief of survivors and the propaganda of the Revolution. Thus, the aftermath of the Frontier War reveals a troubling paradox. The figure most vilified as the hair buyer endured, while the real victims, the children, remained anonymous, their lives reduced to numbers in registers or rumors in newspapers. What endured most powerfully was not justice but memory, shaped into narratives that served each side's political needs. Patriots remembered Hamilton as proof of British barbarity. Native peoples remembered Naden-Teton as proof of American treachery. Between them lay the silent absence of children who had no voice in the making of history. History often remembers villains more vividly than victims. In the saga of the revolutionary frontier, Henry Hamilton stands immortalized as the hair buyer, his name tied forever to accusations of scalp bounties and child murder. Yet the true verdict of history is more complex and more damning than a single man's reputation. The horror of the Appalachian frontier was not the work of one villain, but of a system of war that ensured children became casualties, whether by bullet, fire, starvation, or forced captivity. The evidence does not sustain the charge that Hamilton kept books of scalps purchased from native warriors. No receipts survive, no orders explicitly call for payments. In that sense, the famous accusation was propaganda. But this narrow acquittal does not absolve him, or the empire he served. Hamilton presided over Detroit, the hub through which supplies, weapons, and encouragement flowed to raiding parties. He accepted captives, many of them children, into his jurisdiction, knowing full well how they had been taken. He benefited from a strategy that predictably ravaged families. His guilt, therefore, was not in the details of scalp bounties, but in his complicity in a system that made atrocity routine. The British Crown bears its share of responsibility. From Amherst's letters in 1763 to the calculated use of irregular warfare in the Revolution, the empire chose to fight a war that blurred all boundaries between soldier and civilian. It relied on allies whose tactics guaranteed that women and children would suffer. It tolerated the destruction of homesteads, the abduction of minors, and the delivery of human captives as trophies of war. The death of Appalachian children was not accidental. It was foreseen, accepted, and woven into the strategy of imperial defense. But to isolate Britain as uniquely culpable would be to distort the truth. The Gnadentine massacre, carried out by patriot militia, shows that Americans too were capable of slaughtering children in the name of vengeance. In frontier war, atrocity was not the exception but the rule. Settlers justified killing native children as revenge for raids. Native warriors justified the execution of captives as retribution for burned villages. Each side claimed the mantle of justice, but in practice, children bore the brunt of a logic that defined entire communities as enemies. What endures from these events is the silence of the victims themselves. The names of Hamilton and Jefferson echo in documents. The speeches of leaders and the letters of generals are preserved, but the children of Ruddle's Station, Wyoming Valley, and Naden-Tenton remain nameless in the official record. Their voices survive only as shadows and testimony, a mother describing a child lost on the march, a survivor recalling the execution of the young in a Pennsylvania village, a register noting an unnamed boy delivered to Detroit. History records their absence more than their presence. The verdict, then, is twofold. Against Hamilton, the evidence convicts not of scalp buying but of presiding over and enabling a system of terror. Against Britain, the evidence convicts of sanctioning a strategy that made child suffering inevitable. Against America, the evidence convicts of committing its own atrocities, stripping away any illusion of moral purity. And against the war itself, the verdict is that it consumed the innocent without distinction, leaving behind only scars and myths. The myth of the hair buyer outlasted the war because it gave grief a name. Settler families needed a face to blame, a villain to embody the chaos that had destroyed their homes. Hamilton provided that face, and propaganda amplified it. Yet the deeper truth is more unsettling. There was no single monster. The system itself was monstrous, and it operated through many hands. The children of the Appalachians remind us of this darker reality. They did not march under flags or carry muskets. They were not soldiers or politicians, yet they became the most frequent victims of a war that turned families into targets and survival into chance. Their suffering cannot be reduced to propaganda, nor dismissed as collateral damage. It was central to the way the frontier war was fought. In the final measure, Hamilton's legacy matters less than theirs. Whether or not he bought hair is a question for historians. What is beyond doubt is that under his command, and under King George's rule, countless children were killed, starved, or carried into captivity. That truth is the real indictment, not of a single man, but of an era when empire, rebellion, and revenge treated childhood as expendable. The story closes not with justice, but with memory. Hamilton lived, exchanged, and served again. Jefferson rose to higher office. But the graves of frontier children, scattered along rivers and forests, remain the truest verdict of the war. They testify to a world where innocence offered no shield, and where history itself became complicit by remembering the villains more clearly than the victims. History's darkest chapters are not defined by generals or crowns, but by the silence of those who could not speak. The children lost in war. On the Appalachian frontier, they became victims of empire, rebellion, and revenge alike. Their suffering was not incidental. It was built into the system of terror that consumed an entire generation. Remembering them forces us to confront the cruelty buried beneath patriotic myths and imperial claims. If you believe history's true lessons lie in its most painful truths, join us here. Subscribe now, and continue uncovering the stories the past tried to bury.